y un día decidieron tirar la toalla, o tal vez solo tenderla hasta nuevo aviso. Lo que escucharás a continuación no es obra de la inteligencia artificial. En verdad, esto acaba de pasar en uno de los programas más sintonizados de la CNN. Nayib Bukele, nuevamente el protagonista de esta historia. Pero esta vez, parece, hubo una lobotomía en la mesa editorial. Bukele, para la CNN, ya no es más el dictador, el abusivo que mete presos a los inocentes. Farid Zakaria, conductor del programa GPS de esta cadena estadounidense, ha tenido las siguientes palabras sobre Bukele. Repetimos, no lo vas a creer.
Until recently, El Salvador was the most dangerous country on the planet, a place overrun by gangs. Today it boasts of having a lower murder rate than the United States. This dramatic transformation is the work of Nayib Bukele, the current president who calls himself the coolest dictator in the world.
Una presentación bastante generosa si consideramos como personajes, como por ejemplo Andrés Oppenheimer, de la misma casa televisiva, tildó de dictador y corrupto en potencia al mandatario salvadoreño. Pero en fin, tratemos de entender qué mirada tiene la CNN al respecto. En este caso, ¿es una orden de los demócratas? ¿Es momento de hacer las paces con Bukele y no regalarle la partida a los republicanos?
Here to discuss is Brian Winter, editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly. Brian, in a nutshell, what explains Bukele's enormous popularity?
He has, Fareed, as you noted, overseen a dramatic, not only decline in homicides in El Salvador, down more than 80% in the last couple of years, but also declines in extortion, robberies, and other crimes. Salvadorans feel like they can go out on the street again. They had lost the ability to do that in recent years. He's also tremendously effective on social media. He speaks well. He has leaned into that title that you noted, semi-ironically, of the world's coolest dictator, but it has...
Brian Winter es el analista estadounidense que aparece en pantallas. Habla de un tema bastante real. El Salvador, por fin, es libre de las pandillas. Una verdad que calcina a los opositores de Bukele.
Colorful figure, speaks well. I mean, if you listen to him in interviews, he's articulate. He kind of turns things around and says, well, people say that I'm not being democratic, but what was democratic about the lives that Salvadorans were living through before, when essentially the civil liberties of the majorities were restricted, not being able to go outside, not being able to live their lives in peace, not being able to open businesses without paying off the gangs, and so on. So he has quite cleverly played on the many problems that this country had in the past. Remembering that only 10 years ago, this was a country that had a homicide rate of over 100 per 100,000 people. And if you know those figures, I mean, those are terrible numbers. It was one of the world's most violent countries.
Winter, invitado por la CNN para describir lo que está pasando en El Salvador, se deshizo de elogios para Bukele. Repetimos, lo que estás viendo no es producto de la inteligencia artificial. En verdad, desde Washington, han empezado a cambiar el discurso con el líder salvadoreño.
In a sense, he represents, it seems to me, this sense in certain places that democracy hasn't delivered, that it hasn't delivered for people, and in this case, in the most stark sense, which is the simple act of the government keeping you safe. Is it possible that other Central American countries, Latin American countries will look at this as a kind of example to be followed?
Many of them already are. In other countries around Latin America, such as Ecuador, Nayib Bukele routinely shows up as being more popular, having a higher approval rating than any national politician. There have been other politicians in other places that have said that they want to follow his example.
A estas alturas, ¿qué hipótesis tienes sobre este sorprendente revés? ¿Un giro político producto de la desesperación de Biden por tomar un poco de la popularidad de Bukele? Tal vez una CNN que ahora se recuesta más en Donald Trump, quien ve con buenos ojos al mandatario salvadoreño.
But, Fareed, all of this has made us ask questions about difficult questions sometimes about the nature of democracy. Because on the one hand, those of us who consider ourselves advocates for democracy and human rights can stand on the outside very upset by these mass arrests, which at times seem arbitrary, the suspension of due process, the state of exception that has existed now in El Salvador for more than a year. But the fact is, the overwhelming support for what Bukele is doing within El Salvador, it cannot be ignored. This was someone who was just reelected again with a huge majority of the vote.
Sí, como acabas de escuchar, desde Estados Unidos se cuestionan si en verdad son los dueños de la democracia y si ellos son quienes deben dictar las reglas para otros países de la región. Ahora bien, en la CNN han planteado otro tema más vinculado a la imaginación.
Tell me how this plays into the immigration debate in the United States. What does it mean, and does he talk about that?
What has happened over the last year and a half or so with the security crackdown that Bukele has done is that the rate at which migrants are leaving El Salvador has fallen by about a third. And in recent months, we've seen, it has to be said, a change, it seems, from the Biden administration in terms of how they handle Bukele. They, as recently as a year ago, were quite publicly calling on him to respect the Constitution, to respect human rights. But starting in late 2023, they seem to adopt a different posture.
Brian Winter ha reconocido entonces el acercamiento de la administración Biden a Bukele, un hecho que, como él mismo plantea, parecía muy lejano hace un tiempo. Sin embargo, hay otro punto que ha detallado Winter. ¿Qué intereses hay ocultos en este acercamiento?
Official was in San Salvador in October, shaking hands publicly with Bukele. We hadn't really seen that before, and the rhetoric in public has changed. I'm told that in private, U.S. officials are still pressing those concerns with Bukele, but there seems to have been a decision to work with this guy. In part because they need him on immigration, and also in part because it doesn't seem like he's going anywhere.
Brian, thank you so much. That was fascinating insight into a small but important country close by.
Thank you for reading.
Repetimos, todo lo que acabamos de observar pasó en un estudio de la CNN. ¿Cuál es el siguiente paso? Infobae hablando maravillas del líder salvadoreño. ¿Qué estrategia tiene la Casa Blanca con Bukele? Se encienden las elecciones en Estados Unidos y parece el factor Bukele entra en juego.
Soy el Jota, Juan José del Castillo, director del canal Prensa Alternativa. Si quieres ser parte de la comunidad de la Patria Grande, suscríbete a nuestro canal. Si es que quieres que te lleguen las notificaciones cada vez que subimos un video, activa la campanita. Si quieres apoyar a nuestro canal económicamente, puedes hacerlo a través de PayPal. El enlace está en la descripción del video. A nombre del equipo de Prensa Alternativa, me despido con esta expresión en el quechua milenario, Tupananchis Kama, cuya traducción es hasta volvernos a encontrar. Voz de la Patria Grande.